The probability of randomly assembling just one of the proteins on which life depends is the equivalent of the solar system packed full of blind people, all randomly shuffling Rubik's cubes and all getting the solution at the same time. Working as a satellite designer, I was very familiar with the principles of design, the need to produce a product out the end of the factory door, as it were, that achieved all the objectives, balancing off competing resources and constraints in the design. And, you know, I see evidence of that in the world all around us. For instance, take a vase of flowers. We all know that the vase was designed. Nobody would question that for a moment. But in our culture, we're told that the flowers, well, they're the results of just accidental random processes over billions of years. And yet, the plants that those flowers came from can reproduce themselves. Now, you can't have a communication spacecraft or anything man-made that's capable of reproducing itself. So, to me, the evidence for design in the universe is abundant. Well, I think there are probably four key things. The first one would be an extraordinarily improbable arrangement of things. The second would be that there's evidence of purposeful information, intelligence, if you like. The third one would be, as I've just mentioned, that optimal trade-off between competing objectives and constraints. And the fourth one is that you have the correct components correctly assembled together. So if we look at those in turn, the first one I think is, a good analogy would be you're walking along the beach and you're looking at these pebbles in the sand, and then you come across an arrangement of pebbles in a nice little circle with two dots and a line, and, you know, it's a face. Now, if you saw that, you would know immediately that there's been some external intelligent intervention acting on those pebbles to make a face. It's not that the random action of wind and waves and what have you acting on pebbles typically makes faces, because if that was true, the beach would be littered with little faces looking at you, but it's not like that. So we can instinctively recognise that something has acted on the pebbles. There's been an external intelligence acting. So that's an example, for instance. As time progresses, what we observe in the universe is that things actually deteriorate. They unravel, they get worse and worse. So if you started off with a face, time and chance will fairly quickly rearrange that, and so maybe if you came back the next week, it would no longer be there. And in fact, there's a law in the laws of thermodynamics, it's called the second law, and it says that in any naturally occurring process in an isolated system over time, disorder will increase. Well, the scientists have a commitment to if you like, a worldview, a principle that begins by assuming that there's no God. And if you assume there's no God, that means you limit everything. All your explanations have to be naturalistic explanations. So they can't deviate from that because of an initial assumption. So that's why you end up with, for instance, millions and millions of years of supposed Earth history, because you need that much time to establish complex arrangements of things, like pebbles on a beach, except they don't. The probability of randomly assembling just one of the proteins on which life depends is the equivalent of the solar system. Now, think about this, the solar system packed full of blind people, all randomly shuffling Rubik's cubes and all getting the solution at the same time. People who are very clever, like there's a guy called George Wald who received the Nobel Prize, and he's a very clever guy. And he actually said, he acknowledged that it's impossible for non-living matter to assemble itself and become a living thing, a process called abiogenesis. He said it's impossible, and you think, oh, he's got it. But then he goes on and says, yet here we are, I believe, as a result of spontaneous generation. So there are 5 levels of information. Now, what we see, and by the way, purposeful information only ever comes from a mind, comes from an intellect, not by random processes. So the naturalistic explanations or attempts at naturalistic explanations fail at the purpose level, because the moment you introduce purpose, Now you've got a mind behind the process. I see purpose in the information in the universe. Take the DNA code, for instance. The DNA doesn't just exist there to do stuff pragmatically, randomly. It does it for a purpose, and the purpose is the thriving development of that particular living organism. So we find purposeful information everywhere throughout the universe. And it's so evident in man-made things like communication spacecraft. Equally, in fact, more evident in living organisms. So information can only arise from a mind. Now, those 5 levels I was talking about of information were articulated by a very famous information scientist called Dr. Werner. These are like theorems that come out of information theory. He says, no information can exist without an initial mental source. That is, information is by nature a mental and not a material quantity. Abstract thing, like I can't give you a kilogram of English, right? So it's non-material. So the conclusion of that is information comes from an intelligence. The second theorem from Werner was no information can exist in purely statistical processes. In other words, information cannot arise by chance. So when you look at an organism, what you find is that they have the correct components doing the right job, and they're correctly assembled. Now, assembly requires intelligence. You can't accidentally assemble a whole bunch of components, even if you had the correct ones. Everywhere, that speaks of a personal being that is loving, it is incredibly creative, and just enjoys beauty for its own sake. And we enjoy beauty for its own sake as well, beyond any possible doubt that we live in a designed universe, which of course means that there must be a designer.